All right, welcome to Cloud on Air live webinars from Google Cloud. My name is Anthony Bushong, and I'm a Kubernetes specialist at Google, and I'm joined by...
My name's Ed Hofmann, and I am a customer engineer here at Google.
So today we'll be taking a first look at Anthos. We're really excited to talk about this topic, so feel free to ask us questions anytime on the platform, and we have Googlers on standby to answer them. That being said, let's get started. So Anthos is what brought us all here today, right, Ed?
Yep.
And so if you were not able to catch up on the news, Anthos was recently announced at our annual conference for Google Cloud Next. So that was about a couple weeks ago, and we had our Google CEO, Sundar, actually take the stage and talk about how Anthos is being released to solve a myriad of hybrid and multi-cloud types of problems. And so there are several kind of announcements and presentations that cover the different technologies on Anthos. But what you'll see here kind of in this slide, I think really encapsulates this, is it's built on open source technology that we want to be able to enable to run anywhere, right? So that means in Google Cloud Platform, that means in your on-premises data centers, and also means in third-party clouds. So I think Urs has a great quote, calling it the Linux of the cloud age. And so what I think, and I've often heard Anthos and Kubernetes described as this, is that really the end goal is that it's similar to kind of what operating systems bring to abstraction over hardware, right? So when we think about operating systems, for the most part, it shouldn't matter whether we're running kind of AMD or Intel underneath, right? We have that interface at the operating system level. So we believe that working across different types of cloud environments, public or private, we believe that Anthos should be that interface where we say, okay, I want to get this Kubernetes environment running in GCP, in my data center. For the most part, we should be concerned about how to configure that at the Anthos and Kubernetes level.
And I really think when you take a look at it holistically, the goal is to really provide a consistent experience anywhere.
Precisely. And I think that initially a lot of folks will think about that at an infrastructure level, but as we'll see walking through the different components of Anthos today, that a lot of that actually raises it a level higher, right? To start thinking about, okay, if we have infrastructure taken care of, how do we think about our services and manage those, right? So these are, at a very high level, the different components of the Anthos hybrid platform here. So you'll see that it is, again, based on Kubernetes technology. Hopefully everyone watching is familiar with Kubernetes. I'll try and do one quick sentence if you're not. Kubernetes is a method for scheduling and running containerized apps across multiple VMs or multiple hosts, right? So it gives us a clean API to do this. It's declarative. And so a lot of folks have already begun to adopt this, whether it's in their own Kubernetes clusters, in other environments, or on Google Kubernetes Engine within Google Cloud. So when we think about that, a lot of folks have been, let's think in the Google Cloud kind of environment first. A lot of folks have taken advantage of GKE. It's something that's been GA for almost 4 years as a managed Kubernetes environment. And so a lot of customers came to us and wanted that same experience elsewhere, right? But when we think of Kubernetes elsewhere, there are 40 kind of different ways to bootstrap Kubernetes clusters.
There's so many different ways.
Yeah, totally. And so folks were looking to Google for somewhat of an opinion and also an experience that mirrored what they had within Google Kubernetes Engine, right? So Anthos looks to solve that problem first with GKE on-prem. So we'll talk a little bit about how that solves providing the same management that you have within Google Cloud Platform for Kubernetes in different environments, right? And so once we, I think Anthos, a lot of folks might kind of, box it in as like, oh, okay, it's an on-prem Kubernetes solution, but that's only solving part of the problem, right? When we start to think about modernizing our applications, we want to start thinking about, at a service level, how can we actually manage those, right? So not actually thinking and tying ourselves strictly to the host, but we're trying to solve that by bringing that management experience with GKE on-prem, but we're also trying to enable the adoption of Istio to start thinking at a service level and provide management features there. So you'll see this within Istio and Service Mesh, which we'll talk about. And then finally at the top, you'll see here that there's Anthos provides things around cluster management. So we'll look at some of the kind of multi-cluster features that Anthos provides. Once you have Kubernetes in your data centers, Kubernetes in a different cloud, and GKE, how do you actually manage workloads across that? And how do you actually enable consistency across it, like you said, Ed? So some of these features will come up in configuration management, policy management, and service management.
Awesome.
Cool. So let's actually, I think that as we walk through each of these components, just keep in mind the core values that Anthos seeks to bring in each of these features, right? So modernizing in place, I think I've alluded to that, but really being able to have the similar experience you have within GKE in your data centers. Automating policy at scale, I think is, once we're running into this multi-cluster issue, how do we ensure configuration consistency across all of these? How do we protect ourselves from environment drift across these different Kubernetes clusters for various reasons, right? Whether it's application-specific security policies or something like compliance, right? And then finally, across all of these, we want a consistent experience. I think obviously Kubernetes supports a container image, so if you build that once, you can deploy that anywhere. I think that the way I kind of think about it, and I've had a lot of kind of colleagues describe it this way, is that train your team once too, right? So train your team to interface with Anthos once, and then you can manage that in any particular environment. So I'm going to walk through the infrastructure level, and we're going to build on top of that and start to move into what Anthos provides as services. But first is GKE on-prem. And so GKE on-prem is something that we have brought, I think it was announced at last year's Next, and kind of we demoed it. The main idea here is that we have an opinionated distribution and management experience for running Kubernetes outside of GCP. Right, so what this means is that for all of the kind of the configuration, the node actual configuration, how we handle upgrades, and how we take advantage of GCP services like Stackdriver logging and monitoring, across all of these different environments, we want to bring outside of Google Cloud alone. Right, so what this actually looks like, in its first release, we have support for GKE on-prem within VMware's vSphere. Right, so the way that we actually have this is that within vSphere, we have an admin workstation that can actually interface and create a GKE on-prem cluster. So in the same way that we utilize gCloud in Google Cloud, we have GKE Cuddle, which can actually help you configure your GKE on-prem environment. And so we actually look at this architecture diagram. There's a lot going on. So what I'm going to note is that we actually, this admin station interfaces with an admin cluster first. So we can think of it a little bit like Kubeception, where we are actually managing the control planes for the clusters where, let's say, you would deploy your workloads from its own Kubernetes cluster. So this admin cluster can support multiple different user clusters that you might create within your VMware environment. And then these user clusters are where you actually will deploy your container images and run your workloads, right? So you can see here that we have a single admin cluster that can manage many multiple user clusters. The other dependency that we have outside of that is that we are actually utilizing F5 for that layer 4, or providing that service capability to your Kubernetes workloads, right? So in this environment, in this first release, we are looking at basically having an admin workstation that creates this admin cluster, which interacts with vCenter APIs to provision the appropriate resources. And then from there, we can use kubectl and all the other standard tooling that we'd like to utilize with our cluster and interact with the clusters that will actually run our workloads. So in the future, I would point folks to the fact that we are looking for more platform support and working heavily with first-party kind of infrastructure providers, VMware obviously, but also Dell, EMC, HP, Intel, and Lenovo, right? So, let's say that we have a consistent Kubernetes environment with GKE on-prem, and this is enabled in our data centers. Now what? This is where we start to see that, from an infrastructure perspective, GKE on-prem is great, but we're starting to build, features and interfaces at a higher level. So one of those is actually being able to visualize and have a single pane of glass of your GKE and GKE on-prem environments from the Google Cloud Platform console. So hopefully, folks have seen this before. If you haven't, this is a bit of a kind of a mock. So let's actually dive into the console and see what that looks like. So what you'll see here is the standard Kubernetes engine user interface. And you'll see here that I have a couple GKE clusters that I've created before. One is running Jenkins, one is running Spinnaker. That's great. Those aren't particularly relevant to this presentation. But what I want to call to your attention to is a couple distinct pieces here. So one is the fact that I have an external cluster here. And so this is something that if you had a GKE on-prem cluster, your GKE on-prem clusters would be visible within this user interface. And you can say location, I don't know, data center, or whatever you want to call that, right? But what you'll actually see here in the labels here is that I've actually provisioned this for another cloud, and the provider here is actually Kops. So Kops is a very popular tool, open source, to actually create a Kubernetes cluster. And so that's something where you'll note that this wasn't created by GKE on-prem, yet I'm still able to actually observe that cluster. So we see how many resources it has allocatable within it, and I can see that from the GKE UI. And the reason that that's important is that while we have this functionality to support GKE on-prem clusters, you can bring your existing clusters into the kind of Kubernetes engine console, or we'd like to call it the hub. And you can actually register those clusters. So you can actually take existing clusters and provision those. You have to create a service account and then deploy a cluster-side agent that will actually dial back to our APIs here. But this is great for folks who already have an existing Kubernetes footprint and want to be able to observe their workloads across environments. So what I mean by observe our workloads is we can actually go into the GKE UI, and you'll see here that I have a whole bunch of GKE workloads that I'm running here. But you'll also find is that if I filter by that Kops cluster running in other cloud, we can see that I can actually look at those workloads, look at their status, look at the number of pods supporting those deployments, and what have you. Right. So these are, this is, I think, incredibly useful for folks that may not want to or may not have an on-premises environment, but still want to integrate their existing Kubernetes workloads into this UI while also using GKE, right? So that's something that is made possible by a couple technologies, GKE Connect and GKE Hub. And so again, to reiterate, this is great for GKE on-prem, and you certainly will be kind of using this to look at your GKE on-prem workloads as well. But this is for any Kubernetes cluster, whether it's one you create somewhere on your laptop on Minikube, or other managed Kubernetes environments, or other Kubernetes clusters that you bootstrap yourself.
Oh, nice.
So there are a couple other things we can do once we have a cluster registered. So one of the things that I want to call out is the GCP marketplace, right? So this is something where, again, if we want standardized way of running third-party solutions across our different Kubernetes environments, this is something that was already built to support Kubernetes engine clusters in Google, and we can now bring that capability of deploying third-party solutions to any Kubernetes cluster that you have registered. So what we'll actually look at here in the console is that now that I have my Kubernetes engine cluster and my Kops cluster registered within the console, I can actually go in to look at the actual third-party solutions and partner solutions that we have in our Kubernetes GCP marketplace. So an example might be CloudBees. So you'll see that I had a Jenkins cluster. What if I wanted to use CloudBees Core instead? I can actually go into configure. What I should be able to see is the multiple clusters that are actually available within the Kubernetes engine console. So you'll see here I had those two GKE clusters, and I could technically deploy that to those. But I can also deploy it to my external cluster. And so in the same way that, as long as you get any functioning Kubernetes cluster with a functioning API server, you deploy the agent, you get it registered in the console, we can begin to do things like view our workloads or deploy consistent third-party solutions that are standardized across environments, right? So immediately, we're looking to solve multi-cluster issues or difficult multi-cluster problems where folks can actually interface with these different Kubernetes environments through a standard way. Just to bring it back to the message that we began with, a lot of these are focused at the very kind of like, let me think about this in a Kubernetes way. How can I have a consistent management experience for my infrastructure? How can I kind of have a consistent way to look at the actual applications or the pods, the very kind of I'd still think that the Kubernetes resources are a bit low level. But again, Anthos is built to solve problems at the higher, higher level, at the service level, right? Ed, so why don't you, we're going to switch to you now, and why don't you walk us through how Anthos solves those problems?
Yeah, so if you want, we can start talking about Cloud Services Mesh. So what this is a suite of tools to help you operate, deploy, secure your services. It's all powered by Istio.
And so this is something that I think actually is still on my slide deck, so let's get that switched real quick.
There we go.
There we go.
Yep.
Go ahead,
So what this gives you the ability is provides an abstraction over your metrics, logging, tracing, and SLO monitoring. It also provides you service identity, authorization, and encryption. And then on top of that, including that, you also get traffic management. So think of routing and load balancing and rate limiting for your services. Yeah. And the one thing that CSM is looking to do is to kind of move away from the my applications run in a VM and even my applications run in an individual container, and to really start thinking about your applications as a service and the various versions of your application that all make up your service that provides your application and the end user experience.
Yeah, and so just to clarify, this is something I think you mentioned, it's powered by Istio.
Yep.
So at a very high level, if folks aren't familiar with Istio, how can we kind of quickly describe that for them?
So Kubernetes is great for your container orchestration and kind of managing your I like to think of like almost your infrastructure for your application at scale. But now that you have that, how do you make sure that you know what's going on? So how do you have observability? How do you also check to make sure that everything's secure? And then also on top of this, how do you handle advanced networking features? Right. Really, we kind of moved a lot towards this DevOps model where a lot of the developers have taken on a lot more control and more operations focused. And really what Istio provides is a YAML-based interface for doing networking, which is incredibly powerful.
Yeah, and so it looks like once you have Istio set up, we're able to kind of do things like circuit breaking or traffic shifting between like different versions of an application in a nice declarative way. And then CSM is actually providing a suite of tools to actually consume that data that we have about each of our services from an interface that, again, brings us to think about things at a service level and less of like, hey, what's the CPU load on like pod 3 or something like that.
Exactly.
Okay.
And then the next aspect is now that you have all these clusters up and running, really Anthos configuration management comes in to really make sure you have the consistent experience across your clusters. So what it's actually doing is it'll define multi-cluster policies and really anything that's a Kubernetes resource within your cluster. So you can have multiple clusters, multiple tenants, and one specification. So you can handle managing RBAC, quotas, namespaces, even deployments and custom resources that you've defined within your cluster. So you can use this. You can use a single source of truth, and the concept of this is called GitOps. And the idea is pushing your configuration into a Git repository and running your checks against that Git repository, and then when that's approved, pushing that out to your production clusters. And from experience and from talking with customers about this, the real powerful aspect is it's very easy to manage 1 or 2 or even 10 clusters. But when you start managing 100, 1,000, 10,000 clusters, how do you make sure that everything is running like it's supposed to and everything's deployed and set up as it's supposed to?
Yeah, so as far as I understand it, at that type of scale, our workflow would actually end at the Git repo, right?
Yep.
And then everything within Anthos config management is actually handled cluster side, where it will reconcile cluster state with what is defined in Git, right?
Exactly. So within the configuration management, it actually runs a sync deployment that will sync the repo back to the cluster, and then deploy and audit and reset up anything that's been changed within the cluster.
Okay, yeah. I mean, there's, I think on the slide we have RBAC and resource quotas kind of mentioned, or actual like namespace topology mentioned as good use cases. But I think if you're using things like network policies, You want to have like standard daemon sets for logging or something like that.
Exactly. If you want to create cluster roles or cluster role bindings, or even if you want to deploy services like cube state metrics to pull all that information into whatever third-party tools you're using, Anthos Configuration Management is a great place to have a centralized place to set all that up for you.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Yep. And real quick, if we can switch over to my screen. So right here, we have a repository of what your configuration management directory looks like. So in this, you'll see 4 folders. The first folder is your cluster folder. This is where you'll put any cluster scope resources. So if we click into here, you'll see that we have some cluster role bindings, as well as some cluster roles, such as like pod creator and deployment creator. And then if we go, our cluster registry is a registry that scopes all of our resources and our various clusters that we have up and running. So if we look in this, I have a bunch of like cluster groupings or labels, and these are like Canary, Central, East, EU West, and Production and West, and also definitions for what our clusters actually look like. So you'll see here like CSP Canary 1. This actually goes into and defines and creates labels for our clusters. So if we go back here, now the fun begins within the namespace folder. So within here, we define folders with our various namespaces. And we have services that are created here outside of the namespaces, and these are run within every one of the namespaces. So for example, here, because these clusters are running Istio, I've actually created a Redis service that'll be set up in all of the namespaces within the cluster. So any deployment that gets run on that will have access to the Redis service closest to it. You also have the ability to group namespaces together. So in this example here, we have a pre-production environment, and right now we have a quota here that's set and deployed to each of these development and staging environments. And then, of course, the last folder here is a system repo, and this is just to set up how the repository looks like, and as well as set up any of the advanced configurations. Within the configuration management platform, you have the ability when you're doing quotas to either assign the quotas to each individual namespace or to do an aggregation level, and that'll be set within the repo here. But let's actually go and show what we can do with this. So if we go over to the other screen, right now I have a Nginx deployment here that's pushing to our production environment. So we'll see this here. It's within our production namespace. And if we do a kubectl get pods, because I'm in my production namespace in this cluster, we see that we have 2 pods running for this deployment. So if I actually push this, so I've already synced this repository. If we actually push this, and it'll make the change and push the updated deployment to our cluster. If we give this a minute or 2, hopefully this should start running. And we see right here, it's already starting the process of bringing up another pod within this deployment. And so this is powerful because now as a user, and as you can use your Git repos to actually go and deploy and as part of your deployment process and pipeline. Right. So you want to go back to Anthony?
Yeah, so let's actually switch over to my screen. And so this is a lot of the different pieces that we covered today, kind of laid out in a quick architecture diagram here, right?
Yep.
So what we see here is that we have kind of the different Kubernetes environments here. We have GKE, we have GKE on-prem. This could be a different Kubernetes environment as well. And then what these do is, we report back utilizing GKE Connect to the centralized UI that I showed.
Yep.
And then within this, we also deploy a config management operator, right? So this is something that will be running in each of your Kubernetes clusters. You can configure a custom resource that basically points to what repo you're looking at, what policy directory has all the kind of files that Ed showed, and then those those resources will apply those changes cluster side, right, to ensure that consistency. And then if we wanted to, we can set up traditional networking things like interconnects or VPNs between these different environments should we need cross-cluster traffic, right?
Yep.
And then you'll see here finally that we can also utilize the GCP marketplace to deploy applications from partners and what have you to each of these Kubernetes environments. So that's kind of the Anthos topology that we showed in the very beginning, but I think that we do have some interesting, I think very related technologies that Ed also wants to cover.
So up here we have Cloud Run, which is a beta service right now. What it is a fully managed serverless offering. The way that it works is you basically provide it information on a container, and all of this is based on Knative serving. And what it does is it'll handle stateless containers that support HTTP requests. It has built-in domain handling and also scales down to 0. So this really gives you the ability to kind of run your deployments anywhere, or run your applications anywhere. And this is mostly focused on like stateless applications. So think of like a simple web server. And one of the things that we also have now in beta, you have Cloud Run on GKE. And what that allows you to do is actually run Cloud Run and actually have this deployed and running within your Kubernetes clusters, giving you the ability to really run this anywhere and giving you a very simple setup on setting up Knative.
Right, yeah, and so Knative, if I understand it correctly, is basically, again, much like how we describe Anthos, it's built on top of Kubernetes and Istio, right?
Yep.
So this is basically a way where we have some custom resources where I don't have to configure, and let's think in the Kubernetes model, we might have to configure a deployment, a load balancer or a service, and then we might have to configure destination rules and virtual services in Istio just to get something up and running, right? So we're looking at bare minimum 4 or 5 YAML files, which is great if you have a kind of mature CI/CD pipeline or a great workflow defined for getting all the and managing all these different resources. But with Knative, we kind of can just have a K service, or I believe is the name of it, right? And so we have the ability for to have sort of almost like I think of it like an app engine where we have like one config file, app.yaml, and we get it into an environment. Knative gives us that, except open source, right? So we can bring that between this fully managed serverless platform. Well, we can have, it looks like, and I think you have a demo for us after this slide, but basically we can take things to run in a fully managed environment, and then we can also bring that to any Knative cluster anywhere.
Yep. So why don't we get into a quick demo here on this. So what we're going to do here is we're going to create a Knative service. So we're actually going to, here, all we have to do is we're going to go select our image. So this is an image here that I created, a simple Golang web server. I'm going to select the location, and it's going to select one of my GKE clusters. So you see right here, it gives us the ability to either run it on Cloud Run or on my GKE cluster.
Yeah. So
and I'm going to
just before we keep going with that, so it looks like it doesn't matter. So if you didn't have any GKE clusters, you could still run it.
You could still run it within the Cloud Run region, yes. Okay. But this gives you the ability to run this wherever when you run this on GKE. And we have the ability to run this in a particular namespace. So I'm going to run this within our production namespace. And then on the authentication side, we want to be able to access this service. So we're going to actually click external, and we're going to create this service here. So we'll give this a little bit. It should be fairly quick to spin up and get running within our cluster. It'll let us know right here that the revision is healthy and serving traffic. And the beautiful thing right here is we have a URL which we define within our clusters. And if we actually click on this URL, we get a nice little web page that with a view of the bay from my desk, and that shows the time. So it's a pretty powerful, a pretty simple way of getting up and running with something and starting to spin up these applications.
Right. And so again, this is built on the very foundations of Anthos with Kubernetes and Istio.
Yep, exactly.
Cool. All right. So looking over to kind of my slide deck now, Ed, do you want to walk us through sort of, there are a lot of different components that we've shown within Anthos. So what's actually available for folks? This is a first look as advertised, so we want to encourage folks to look at the pieces that they can interact with today, right?
Exactly. So right now, What's available today is you have the ability to run Cloud Run on Google Cloud as well as on your GKE clusters. You also have the ability to run the GCP marketplace between Google Cloud and on-prem. And you also have the ability to run the Anthos configuration management on GCP and on-prem. And then as you get lower and lower into this kind of stack here, you also have the ability to run, obviously, GKE and GKE on-prem, and of course, any other variants of Kubernetes that you have up and running.
Mm-hmm. So to kind of wrap up, what we're looking at here is this new stack for cloud native and modern applications running on Google Cloud. And I think the way we see it is, you can kind of think of these technologies by their persona. We can think of folks who are looking to interact with Kubernetes and manage infrastructure, or let's say all of their different internal teams or business units or their customers, they can manage infrastructure in a consistent and managed way. They, you might have folks that are SREs responsible for, let's say, SLOs on a given service. And so this is something where Istio provides that type of visibility into things that will allow them to create things like SLO alerting and SLO violations, and not just think of like, what's the CPU load on the servers running my applications. And then finally, we have a way for developers to use this system as well, right? And so I think what you'll find across here is that all of these are open source based technologies, but within Google, we're making the experience first class and provide a consistent way to use things like Knative, things like Istio, and things like Kubernetes, right? So what we're really looking at here is that Anthos is the logical successor to a lot of the Kubernetes work that really began at Google with GKE many years ago, going GA in 2015. We've had tons of folks want this experience on-prem. We've had tons of folks begin to adopt service meshes with Istio in these environments. And we've had folks just having to manage multiple clusters, even within GKE themselves. So Anthos brings us a suite of tools that addresses all of these things that we've seen from the the almost 4 years of folks running Kubernetes with Google Cloud. So now it's time for a quick break. We'll be back in about a minute with some frequently asked questions. All right, so we're back with some frequently asked questions. So I guess I'll take the first one. Looks like someone is asking, what about future capabilities or possibilities of Anthos and big data technologies? So I want to note today that in the marketplace, I'm sure there are some specific ways to run some of the big data solutions that are being kind of ported into Kubernetes environments. One of them would be the Spark data processing technology. I believe we have that in marketplace with an operator to actually deploy that into Kubernetes environments. So this is something where with GKE on-prem and GKE, we could actually deploy a consistent big data solution across both of those, right?
And then I think the other thing that you can look at is using a service like Istio, which can provide you consistent endpoints for any of your big data applications to actually point back out to, let's say, like BigQuery or Spanner or Dataflow or Dataproc.
Cool. All right, so the second question is, what is GKE Enterprise and how is it different from GKE on-prem?
So when we think about GKE Enterprise, the focus is on bringing, obviously bringing a financially backed SLA into GKE, but also adding new services and features to make operating and managing your GKE clusters much easier. So these are things like vertical pod auto scaling. So being able to provide recommendations on how your applications are running and what the resources that they should be required, as well as some security features like binary authorization, which gives you the ability to only really deploy any signed services within your application. And then even when you're thinking at the cluster level, even things like node auto provisioning. So giving you the ability to set the maximum amount of nodes and having the system in GKE really provide the smarts into creating and deploying additional node pools depending on what your services actually need.
Right. So the next question is, can a service running on AWS and GCP be part of the same service mesh? So I think to clarify, I think my response will be framed in, basically it sounds like if you have a cluster in AWS and a cluster in GCP, can you have the same service mesh across those? I think that's something that's being kind of developed in the open source. So if you look at Istio, in 1.1, I believe that there were multiple different ways to implement a multi-cluster service mesh. So one of these is by adopting a single control plane, which assumes no kind of IP overlap between these two different environments, and that all of the Istio control plane are routable, right? So there would be a lot of configuration in that across clouds. The second kind of approach, and I think Megan, one of the developer program engineers, published a blog on this, is the multi-cluster Istio mesh with a multi-control plane topology. And so the way that actually works is that communication goes through the gateways between each of these clusters, right? So a bit of a different thing of like, are the pod IPs for different parts of the Istio control plane routable? Now we just are concerned with the gateways model. Either way you approach it, this is something that is still very nascent, I think. And it does require a lot of connectivity set up under the hood. That's not as simple as saying like, can I run Istio in a single cluster, enable sidecar injection, and then kind of, close my eyes. Yeah. So this is something that I think that long term is absolutely part of the vision, but it again is still in a bit of early days.
Yeah.
So the last question here is Cloud Run also good for stateful data in GKE?
So really, a lot of the big features and kind of controls with like Cloud Run gives you the ability to scale down to zero. And because of the way that Cloud Run operates and the way Knative actually works under the hood, is that if there's no external requests coming to the service, then the service will actually scale down to zero. So unfortunately, Cloud Run isn't a good use for any stateful data or any stateful services. But what you have the ability to do, especially within Kubernetes, you can create deployments, you can create stateful sets to give you a much better interface and a much better operations for those services. So like a simple example would be if you're running a database within you're running like a clustered database within your Kubernetes environment, the last thing you'd want is for a pod to go down in your deployment and then having to regenerate all that data that's been saved. And that can take a lot of time and cause issues with your platforms.
Right. Awesome. That's all the questions that we have here and all that we have time for. So thank you for tuning in. Please visit Cloud OnAir to discover more content from Google Cloud experts. Experts.
Wow.
All right, so thank you.
Yep, thank you.